How on earth is Jon Jones still the unified heavyweight champion in the UFC? With each day that passes by, this seems to make less and less sense, especially as Tom Aspinall has now been the interim champion for over 500 days now. Yes, 500 days. So given all the recent developments with regards to fighters moving weight classes, vacating their belts, and Jon Jones still being the champion, it's about time in this video that we answer some questions, such as: should Jon Jones be stripped, and if so, why hasn't he been already? Should Tom Aspinall be waiting around for his opportunity to become the heavyweight champion, or is he wasting his time? And finally, have the UFC shown massive double standards by making Islam Makhachev vacate his lightweight championship to move up to 170? We're going to be answering all of those questions in today's video. Hello guys, and welcome back to Alex on MMA. Before we get into this video, I'm going to ask that you subscribe to the channel, as later on this week we'll be getting into the Merab Dvalishvili versus Sean O'Malley rematch. I've rewatched that first fight, so I'll be doing a breakdown of that. But anyway, onto the topic of this video, and Jon Jones still being the unified champion more than 500 days after Tom Aspinall became the interim champion. Now it does beg the question of, what's the point in these interim belts if the winner of them isn't afforded the opportunity to go and unify the division? Surely the point of this interim belt is that if the champion is forced to have some time off through no fault of their own, so injury or some other delay, then the contender, rather than holding up the division, the number one contender is given the opportunity to fight for the interim title that will eventually lead to a unification fight against the reigning champion. However, we currently find ourselves in a ridiculous situation where Tom Aspinall has actually defended his interim title, and Jon Jones has fought Stipe Miocic in the meantime, who, yes, is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, but had been massively inactive and was in no way really deserving of that heavyweight title shot. So the whole thing seemed to be a bit of a mess. And when you look at sports like boxing, one of the big things that the UFC had over boxing is the fact that you could make all these fights happen because they're under one umbrella. And boxing has so many different governing bodies and different promoters and different broadcasters that it's hard to make the fights that everyone wants. But one advantage of boxing and the different governing bodies is the fact that they've got a clear rule set when it comes to champions defending their belts within certain time periods. You know, with the different governing bodies like the WBC and the IBF, when you become a champion with one of those governing bodies, you're then given a time limit in which to defend that belt, be it against a mandatory challenger or a voluntary challenger. And if you fail to fulfill that obligation, you're then stripped of the belt. And unfortunately, the UFC just doesn't have clear rules when it comes to this stuff. The interim belt seems a bit more of a placeholder rather than a specific title that has rules associated with it, and no real guarantees that you'd be next to fight for the title. So this does lead me to asking the question of why the UFC haven't stripped Jon Jones yet of that heavyweight title. Can the UFC do it? Is there something blocking them? And I think there's a few avenues we can go down here to answer this question. Firstly, you need to understand the context that Jon Jones is the greatest of all time. Whether or not you've got an asterisk by his name because of the drugs cheat, not allegations, but actually he's failed drugs tests in the past, whether you take his antics outside of the ring, if you count them against him. But either way, it's understood that Jon Jones is the greatest fighter the sport's ever seen by a large number of people. So he's a massive asset for the UFC. He's undoubtedly one of the superstars, and we are living in a time where there is a superstar shortage in the UFC. So the UFC want their superstars to be the champions so that they can market them as best as possible. And when it comes to renegotiating broadcast deals, which they do have coming up, they want to have Jon Jones as a champion because they want to have his championship fights as real bargaining chips when it comes to the negotiating table. So I guess from that perspective, it's not really in the interest of the UFC for Jon Jones to lose his belt against the most dangerous heavyweight challenger we've seen in years, because Tom Aspinall is so dangerous. And we're going to be talking soon about whether or not Tom Aspinall should be waiting for Jon Jones at all. But when you look at other reasons why the UFC haven't stripped Jon Jones yet, for what other reason could it be? I do think part of it is that the UFC do want to keep Jon Jones sweet. You noticed in Dana White's post-fight press conferences for the last year, he's been going on and on about how Jon Jones is still pound for pound number one, greatest of all time. And Dana White doesn't use that kind of rhetoric without some kind of reasoning or meaning behind it. And he clearly wants to keep Jon Jones on his side. I think there was some fallout after the Francis Ngannou negotiations fell apart, and there were question marks of whether or not Dana White could offer his biggest fighters the contracts and money they deserve. And I just don't think he wants a similar situation with Jon Jones, because if Jon Jones was to leave the organisation, somehow end up fighting Francis Ngannou, maybe not on the PFL, but in boxing or something like that, then Dana White would be missing out on some lucrative business. So I think that he is negotiating with Jon Jones, and probably part of that deal is that Jon Jones can take his time in accepting this fight and fight on a date that suits him. I know that Jon Jones is currently in Thailand and replying to tweets saying that he's not bothered about being stripped of his title. He's going back to his light heavyweight days, saying how he wasn't bothered then when he had to give up the title. But I do feel like this is slightly different, mainly because Jon Jones is clearly towards the end of his career. So he doesn't have the opportunity now really to give up that belt and work his way back up through the rankings and become champion again. Time's just against him. But I think there are a few reasons why I think the UFC haven't stripped him yet. I think they want to keep him sweet for broadcast deals. I don't think they want another Francis Ngannou-like fallout. And like I said, he is one of their superstars. So whether it's from a broadcast deal, marketing deal, and just the perceived look of the company, of the promotional company, it looks better if Jon Jones is the heavyweight champion. So for me, those are a few logical reasons why the UFC have decided not to strip Jon Jones yet. But there is an elephant in the room in the form of Tom Aspinall, the guy who has, as I've already said a couple of times, been the interim champion for over 500 days. So should Tom Aspinall be waiting for this opportunity at all? We've seen this happen before. Michael Chandler in the lightweight division, waiting for a Conor McGregor fight, putting his career on hold for 2 years for a fight that never materialised. That was very, very damaging for Chandler's career, and there are a couple of similarities between these two matchups. The obvious differences being how Tom Aspinall is like a young up-and-comer, a really hungry, dangerous heavyweight, and Michael Chandler was towards the end of his career. But in terms of similarities, Conor McGregor and Jon Jones are the superstar big money fights, a legacy to a certain extent as well, more so you'd argue with Jon Jones. But can Tom Aspinall afford to wait? He already put out a tweet the other day saying how he's found this delay even more difficult than his injury. Because I guess his injury was a bit more black and white. He knew that he just had to wait to recover until he was back fighting again. Whereas fighting against Jon Jones, he just doesn't know whether this fight's going to happen or not. And as they say, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So does it make sense for Tom Aspinall to be making money fighting these lesser contenders in the heavyweight division, even if it means having to do laps of the division and beat fighters who he's already taken out in the first round, just to stay active, stay busy, whilst Jon Jones makes his mind up? It's a really tricky situation for him to be in, because the argument on the other side that says Tom Aspinall should wait is based around this fight being a legacy fight. Because there's no secret, the heavyweight division is an absolute mess at the moment. When you look at the contenders out there, Cyril Gane, who just got blasted by Jon Jones in less than a round, and most of the other contenders Tom Aspinall has already beaten and done it within a round itself. So that's another difference in the comparison between the McGregor and Chandler fight, where Chandler was waiting for McGregor, and this fight between Tom Aspinall and Jon Jones, because the lightweight division was wide open. There were challengers to Islam Makhachev. Conor McGregor wasn't even a champion. So Michael Chandler, rather than waiting for that fight, could have had some amazing matchups with exciting contenders. Whereas what is there left for Tom Aspinall to do other than fighting Jon Jones? And this puts the UFC again in a really precarious position, because you have to weigh up what they're thinking. The UFC clearly wants this fight to happen. Dana White has said it over and over again. They are in the works. This fight is going to happen. He's not put a timestamp on it. But they want Tom Aspinall to fight Jon Jones. Because firstly, who else does Tom Aspinall have to fight? And secondly, this would be a real passing of the torch moment. If Jon Jones retires and Tom Aspinall isn't able to fight him, there'll always be a question mark that he didn't fight the very best. However, if Tom Aspinall goes out there, beats Jon Jones to become the unified champion, and the UFC will be hoping that by the time this is all wrapped up, there'll be more exciting contenders coming through the heavyweight division, because right now that just isn't the case. So the UFC definitely wants this fight to happen. I do think they want Tom Aspinall to beat Jon Jones and become the champion, but they're just not wanting to risk stripping Jon Jones for him to throw his toys out the pram and retire, and then leave a massive question mark over the heavyweight division, leaving it in even more of a mess than it is right now, which is definitely saying something. But anyway, I want to move on by talking about Islam Makhachev and that whole situation, because this is a recent situation where we've seen the belt vacated. Firstly, I do want to point out that we don't really know the details of whether or not Islam Makhachev voluntarily vacated that lightweight title, saying that he's got no interest in going back down after he fights Jack Della Maddalena, or the UFC gave him an ultimatum. Yes, he can move up, but you have to vacate that belt. But based on what we know about the UFC and what we've already spoken about, I'm going to be discussing this on the basis that Islam Makhachev wasn't given the option of holding both belts simultaneously. And does this show massive double standards within the organisation? I think it does, because Islam Makhachev, he's done his time, he's put in the defences, he deserved the opportunity to become double champ. I just feel as though this situation shows a misalignment between what the fans want and what the UFC think that the fans want. Because to me, this Ilia Topuria against Charles Oliveira fight, there was no reason for it to be for a unified title. This is a perfect opportunity if Islam Makhachev would be interested in holding both of the belts simultaneously. It would be a perfect opportunity to have an interim title, because the fight that fans want to see more than any other is Ilia Topuria against Islam Makhachev. That and Jon Jones against Tom Aspinall, they're two of the biggest fights in the UFC right now. So by giving Topuria and Oliveira the interim championship, you could set up a massive fight to unify that lightweight division. I just cannot understand why the UFC wouldn't allow Islam Makhachev this opportunity. And when you're talking about building superstars, there aren't many better ways of doing that than fighters becoming double champ. Look what it did to Conor McGregor, Daniel Cormier. These are the things that elevate fighters from being greats to potential greatest of all time. And it would help Islam Makhachev even leapfrog Khabib when it comes to that GOAT list. I know that a few of you already have Islam Makhachev higher on that list, but something like this would really help Islam Makhachev lead the shadow of Khabib, and it would have been a massive opportunity for him. And I do think there are massive double standards here, because if Jon Jones had wanted to hold the belt simultaneously at light heavyweight and heavyweight, you can bet your bottom dollar that Dana White wouldn't have made him vacate. I know that he said that he's not a big fan of fighters moving up and down weight classes and fighting for belts simultaneously, but if there was ever a fighter to do this with currently, when you're looking down the list of champions, it was Islam Makhachev. But anyway, that's enough about Islam Makhachev. I do want to end this video by giving some final thoughts on the Jon Jones situation, whether or not he should be stripped. And the answer is pretty obvious at this point. If there's been an interim champion for over 500 days who has defended his belt, which is pretty much unheard of, then he should be given the opportunities to fight for that belt. If he's not given the opportunity, then you do have to strip the champion. Unless there's some really, really mitigating circumstances, which means that they can't defend it within the next few months, you have to move on, you have to let the division move on. I understand what the UFC would be giving up at this stage. There'd be a question mark over Tom Aspinall's legacy, but also there'd be a question mark over Jon Jones's. Now, what he's done at light heavyweight has been undeniable, but when you look back at Jon Jones's career, there will be a question mark when it comes to his final days at heavyweight, and the fact that there was an undeniable challenger coming through the ranks, blasting out fighters in the first round, and Jon Jones never fought him. So I think when it comes to the question of legacy, and we spoke about it when we talk about Tom Aspinall, that this is a real legacy fight for him, I do think this would also be a legacy fight for Jon Jones. The guy's already the greatest of all time. He solidified that position through his reign at light heavyweight. However, he could even take that up another notch. I know that Tom Aspinall, he hasn't done all that much in his career yet compared to some of the other greats. But if Jon Jones is able to end his heavyweight career by defeating Tom Aspinall, by defeating the challenger who everyone thinks he was running from, then that would be the final exclamation point on what has been a legendary career. He will have been the greatest of all time at light heavyweight, beaten the former greatest of all time at heavyweight in terms of Stipe Miocic, and then beaten the challenger that everyone said he was running from. So yes, I do believe that Jon Jones should be stripped of the title, but if he's not stripped of the title and he gets this fight and he wins, I do think that would be a perfect way to end a legendary career. However, it would leave the UFC in an absolute mess. Let's face it, Tom Aspinall, the guy that everyone's hedging to be the next long-reigning heavyweight champion, if he was to be beaten by the aging Jon Jones, who would then leave riding off into the sunset, leaving the heavyweight division an absolute mess, who knows what that would mean for the future of the heavyweight division. But anyway, they're my thoughts today. I do believe that Jon Jones should be stripped, but I can kind of understand the reasons why the UFC are very reluctant to do that. Let me know if you agree with what I've said in this video, and I'll see you guys later.